Go to work. All right, greetings and welcome back. We are in Senior English B, and our objective today is to work with Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ode to the West Wind. Okay, so I'm with you on 850. Our objectives here are two parts. We started a few seconds ago by even outlining this. One, we want to be able to say for each of the 5 parts of this poem, what attribute of the west wind, the wind of the fall or of the spring? The fall. What attribute does Shelley focus on? And then 2, what request does Shelley make to the wind? Now, if we know those 2 things for each of those 5 parts, that is to say, if we know those 10 pieces of information, then we know this poem well enough to prep for the exam. Question, Mr. Q.
Are the requests the same in some way?
That's a good question. See, we may find the request is similar, if not synonymous. Although in terms of specific language, we might discover that it's not exactly the same, but it's close. You're absolutely right. Now again, let's go back. We call this poem an ode. We also call it an apostrophe, which means that you have a poet speaking directly to an inanimate object, right? As if that, the wind can actually hear or whatever, okay? All right, let's go to part 1 then. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing. By the way, at 2b, what do we call that when we use a comparison with like or as? Like ghosts. That's right, it's a simile, isn't it? It looks like the word smile, only it's just not quite that word. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes. O thou, here we go. Line 5, 6 is going to tell us what he's focusing on. O thou who charitest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds, where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth, and fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odors plain and hill. Now, that's a long sentence, but we can actually see it as a pretty simple sentence. Go back up the line 5, 6. O thou. Thou, by the way, just means what? You. So he's talking directly to the wind. Thou who charitest. Do you know what a chariot does?
Pulls somebody?
Yeah, it pulls somebody, right? Goes, charitest to their dark wintry bed the winged seeds. What are we talking about? What does the wind do in the fall in regards to seeds? It does. It picks up a seed, carries it, puts it somewhere. Keep reading. Each like a corpse within its grave, which kind of makes sense, right? A seed until it takes depth and starts growing, it's kind of like a corpse in its grave. And thine azure sister of the spring shall blow her clarion over the dreaming earth. So what happens in the spring? Right, the seeds get blown, they land where we live, snow. Then in April, snow melts off. All of a sudden, a differenter breeze starts blowing. What's that? The breeze of? Spring. The spring. And it's like a clarion call, like a loud trumpet being played that says to all of the seeds lying under the ground, time to wake up. And what is it Bambi reminded us of in the spring? Everything gets, what is the word? Twitter-pated? We'll not get into that word. And fill driving sweet buds like flocks to feed in air, with living hues and odors plain and hill. So in other words, what happens in the spring? All of these seeds start to awaken. Where did the seeds come from, though? They were driven there by what wind? Not the spring wind, but what? The west wind, the wind of autumn, right? Destroyer and preserver. Wait a minute, write that one down. How is the wind called a destroyer and a preserver? Well, Ruthie's tree is already starting to lose its green hue. It's already starting to turn red and brown. Very soon, it will turn completely brown, and all those leaves will fall off. Then, what makes those leaves fall off? The west wind. The wind flies through, blows the leaves off the trees. It is a destroyer. How is the west wind also a preserver, though?
Because it also takes the
It takes the seeds, blows them elsewhere, puts them on the ground, where they can then lie corpse-like, like they've been buried, until when?
spring.
See, Shelley's playing an interesting game, the circle of life game, huh? The wind of the fall both destroys, kills, where these tree dies, but it also preserves. It's almost a requirement, right, that seeds get blown elsewhere so they can sit in the ground, wait for 100 days, right? And then all of a sudden the spring wind starts blowing and everything wakes up again, correct? Now that's what he says about the wind. What is his request? Notice what he says. There's a colon there, isn't there? Hear, oh hear. What would you say the request is? Put it in your own words. What is the request that he makes to the west wind in the end of the first part? What's he say to him? What's his request? What does hear, oh hear mean? We would say what today? How would we say it? If I want Lang's attention, what would I say? I might not say hear, oh hear. What would I say? Hey, listen to me. So in other words, the first part ends with Shelley saying, the west wind is interesting because it both destroys as well as preserves, and I want to say something to you. Listen to me. Part 2. Thou, again it's this you word again, apostrophe. Thou on whose stream, mid the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth, decaying leaves are shed. Uh-oh, what's he emphasizing now? The wind does what in the second part? If in the first part it's messing around with dead leaves, what are we going to focus on in the second part? The sky. Outstanding. Frederick even pointed up. The sky. The clouds. Shook from the tangled bow of heaven and ocean. Angels. Uh-oh. Here it comes, right? We know this is true. Angels of rain and lightning. Now, I already said this to you once, but I want to come back and say it again. The people we're reading are all from what place?
England.
They're from England. England is a small rock sitting in the middle of water. Like I said to you, you can get on a plane and fly to Heathrow, the large airport in London. You can rent a car and get in that car and you can drive in any direction and you can be to one of those coasts in virtually no time at all. It's a small rock. Got me? So the weather patterns are determined by all the water that surrounds it. Does that make sense? The sea that bears her bosom to the moon. The winds that will be howling at all hours and are upgathered now like sleeping flowers. You can look at the ocean sometimes and it's dead flat, no wind. Or the wind starts blowing and all of a sudden this body of water can turn into serious danger. One of the major ways that people in England, of course, would lose their life is to go anywhere close to that ocean when it starts, right? Because, I mean, waves can hit that and pull you out very quickly and you drown, right? So it is a scary thing. Notice here, he's going to reference the power the west wind has on the ocean. Some of the worst storms happen in the fall when the wind really starts to blow. Well, you know this is true around here. When that wind really starts kicking up, it can have some pretty devastating effects. What if you want to put a bunch of water with that? Yeah, it's rough. It's rough. So take a look. Angels of rain and lightning, there are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head of some fierce Maenad. Now your sidebar will tell you kind of what's going on there. Notice Shelley loves his similes, right? Several times he's used this like or as theme. In other words, he says the wind blows the ocean and it makes the ocean look like this crazy goddess with crazy hair, right, going everywhere. Even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm. The west wind brings wretched stormy weather, right? Thou dirge of the dying year. What is a dirge? Does anyone know that word? It is. It's like when you got buried and you were going to the graveside, they would play this kind of slow dirge, like drum or whatever. How is the west wind a dirge to the dying year? That's interesting. Some of you have never really thought about that. But think about the way your life has been for 12 years. Right? Think about the way your life has been for 12 years. You have a great 100 days of summer. Yes, no school. Then school starts just about the time the weather starts to change. So, for example, you start getting up in the morning now, and it ain't like getting up in the morning in June. And then the wind starts to blow, which tells you very soon it's going to be Halloween, trick or treat. Then it will, of course, be Thanksgiving and then Christmas, which means the end of the year. As this wind starts to blow in October, you kind of, without realizing it, are being told it's the end of the year, the death of the year. Then, of course, a new year will start, and 100 days into that new year, or less, spring starts. And we start it all up again. It kind of coincides, of course, with your emancipation from school. Of course, next spring will be for you the great emancipation. Yes.
Proclamation.
Yes. Graduation. Notice to finish. Thou dirge of the dying year, in which this closing night will be the dome of a vast sepulchre, vaulted with all thy congregated might of vapors, from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hail will burst. The wind is responsible for pushing around the clouds, which creates all that nasty weather. And then again, his request, notice it's not exactly the same language as the part one, but it's certainly close, isn't it? Again, one more time, listen to me. Hear me. In other words, I've got something to say to you. We haven't heard what it is yet. Notice this poem is in part a celebration of this west wind, but it's also going to be a request. I need you to hear me. I need you to listen to me. But we don't know what it is he's going to say yet. Look at part 3. So in the first part, concentrating, just to review. What is it he looks at? The wind in relationship to what? Clouds. I'm sorry, the first part. The wind in relationship to leaves or seeds. Second, relationship to clouds and the weather and sky. Let's go to the third one. Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean. Now this is interesting. The ocean, the Mediterranean Ocean, have you guys looked at this on a map before to see the Mediterranean Ocean? I'm going to do this to you real quickly. Come around to the other side of my desk. And I'm sorry, this is the only way I can show this to you. By the way, don't get my camera as you come. This will help you. This will help you if you can see this, all right? So you can just stand there. All right, this is my map, okay? Come so you can see this. Trust me, you're going to want to see this. It's possible that nobody's ever pointed this out to you. You've got to learn how to love maps, okay? So everyone get where you can see my map. You've got to be able to see my map. Again, you can stand here as well, okay? This is Africa. This is Africa, right? This is, of course, Europe. This, can everyone see this? This body of water is the Mediterranean Ocean. Now think about this. When you look at that ocean, notice something interesting about it. When you were a kid, do you remember those little swimming pools you played in? Those little plastic swimming pools, they weren't very big. They'd fill them up with water. Do you remember? If somebody big and strong came up to the side of that swimming pool and picked it up and let it go, what happened to all the water in the swimming pool? Think about it. You could pick up the side of a plastic swimming pool and let it drop. What would happen to all of the water? It would start to move. Why? It's got no place to displace to, correct? Because the sides of this plastic swimming pool, correct? Take a look again at my Mediterranean Ocean on this map. Dude, once the wind starts blowing, there is no place for the water to go. The only way out of this ocean is right there, into the Atlantic. It's the only way. If you saw the film 300, you know about in the history of fighting, how this ocean plays a huge role in the ways millions of ships, of people and ships died over the years. Because once the wind starts blowing in the Mediterranean, you can get immediately waves in excess of 30 and 40 feet. The reason is because there's no place for the water to go. Look at it again. It's just like a swimming pool or a big bath, a bathtub. There's no place for the water to go. Once the water starts blowing around, once the wind starts blowing the water in the Mediterranean, there's no place for it to go. As opposed to this, look at this. The Atlantic takes a serious wind to get serious waves in the Atlantic because there's a place for the water to go, right? But in the Mediterranean, it's one of the most dangerous bodies of water because there's no place for the water to go when the wind starts blowing, and the wind does blow at certain times of the year. Shelley's going to focus on that, okay, on the Mediterranean, right, and more particularly the way that the wind can affect the water, because it's kind of like that bathtub thing or that swimming pool thing. All right, now we can go back to work. Now that you understand that, these lines of part 3 will make sense. Whoa. Whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
What is?
All right, let's go back to part 3 now. Thou, see, some of this starts to make sense now. Look at it. Thou, who didst waken from his summer dreams the blue Mediterranean. It's like the Mediterranean Sea's taking a snooze through the summer. But what happens in the fall? I'll tell you what happens in the fall. What I just told you. So, for example, there are people who had to go out on a boat in October on the Mediterranean. Very, very dangerous. It can start out looking like this, and then and all of a sudden you get out in the middle of that ocean, you can't see no land, and all of a sudden the storm comes in, the waves, and it's bad news. You usually know you're about ready to get seriously bummed because there's no place for the water to go. It's just going to go up. Keep reading. Whereby he lay lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams beside a pumice isle in Bai's Bay, and saw in sleep old palaces and towers quivering within the waves' intenser day, all overgrown with azure moss and flowers, so sweet the sense faints picturing them. It's a cool word picture, Keeley. He says, Atlantis, amazing, amazing island, supposedly was in the Mediterranean, and supposedly was covered by water. Right? So it now sits under the ocean. And he imagines under the ocean holds cities where the moss and stuff has overgrown, but when the waves start, you have these huge waves. There, if you were in the bottom of the trough of the wave, you could actually see down into the ocean's floor, and there you would see old palaces and stuff. Again, a poet who's using his imagination when those waves get really high. You know, where the water's been displaced, obviously up high, you can see down to the bottom. That's the game he's playing. Thou for whose path the Atlantic's level powers. Now he's jumped from the Mediterranean to an even larger. You know about this one if you saw Perfect Storm. If you saw that film, Perfect Storm, you know all about what the Atlantic can do. And yes, it can. It can get waves in excess of 100 and more feet. And of course, when that starts to happen, most people don't walk away to tell stories about it, right? It just completely takes over. Cleave, that means cut. Read with me. Cleaves themselves into chasms, while far below the sea blooms and the oozy woods, which where the sapless foliage of the ocean know thy voice, and suddenly grow gray with fear. It's interesting. He personifies the ocean as being capable of fear. And when the ocean sees the wind starting to move, it immediately starts to get really afraid, because it knows you're going to get these intense amounts of storms. And terrible, and tremble and despoil themselves. It's a funny word picture. The ocean gets so afraid, it pees itself when the wind starts blowing. Out of fear, out of fear. Finally, one more time, what's the request? The same one again, right? Oh, hear, listen to me. I got something to say to you. Now in part 4, we're going to finally get some sense of what he wants to say to the wind. Read it with me. If I were a dead leaf, what part? Part 1. Thou mightst bear. If I were a swift cloud, what part? Part 2, with thee. A wave, what part?
3.
Part 3. To pant beneath thy power, and share the impulse of thy strength, only less free than thou. Oh, uncontrollable. So right away, let's point out for your notes. Here now, he's beginning to identify with the wind. And he says, I wish sometimes I could be a leaf, or a cloud, or the ocean, so that I could somehow be affected by the wind in the same way. Notice he says about the wind, it's uncontrollable. If even I, as in my boyhood, and could be the comrade of thy wanderings over heaven. As then, when to outstrip the sky speed scarce seemed a vision. He says as a kid, he used to lie on his back. Some of you maybe did this. Go to the park or whatever, lie on your back in the grass and just look up at the sky and watch the clouds and imagine what it would be like to be carried away on the wind. As a kid, he says, I thought about doing that all the time. He says, I still think about doing that, right? I would never have striven as thus with thee in prayer in my sore need. O lift me as a wave. What part? 3. A leaf. What part? 1. A cloud. What part? You see, you can kind of see he's inverting it, right? I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. What? I fall upon the thorns of life. I bleed. Now this is an interesting line. An interesting word picture. He pictures life as a beautiful rose bush. The flowers are beautiful. But what is painful about roses? Right? The thorns are very painful. What does it mean when he says, I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed? Jot down what you think he means by that. What is he saying about getting older? When he was young, he loved to sit and look at the clouds and dream about being carried on the wind. Look what he says at line 55 about his life now. A heavy, this will sound like for some seniors, they go, I kind of get this now. A heavy weight of hours has chained and bowed one too like thee, tameless, swift, and proud.
So what he was basically saying is that he's no longer got the imagination as a kid, but now he's stuck in reality.
Did you hear what Keeley just said? Boy, oh boy, is that important. Stuck in reality. As he's gotten older. I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed. In other words, I ain't no kid no more. And notice, life has become a heavy weight of hours. It's like this. Right? Starting to kind of push down. Some seniors will report this. They're like, dude, in previous homecoming weeks, it was different. It's like, everything is a little bit more stressed out as I'm getting older. It's like people keep talking to me about what I'm going to do after I graduate and where am I going to go. I'm like, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I'd love to go back to when I was 6 years old and all that mattered was the snacks after ball games and what park we were playing at. And now all of a sudden it's like everybody wants to know what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. See, that's his point. He says as he gets older, he still feels uncontrollable like the wind, but it's different. It's different. He's no longer tameless and swift and proud as he once was. Things have changed for him. Now, let's point out, at the end of part 4, this poem can be kind of depressing, but we've got part 5. And part 5 is quite remarkable. When we think about the fact that Shelley was sitting on a rock next to a body of water, and he was writing this poem in his journals, and then he dies. We know how he dies. How's he die? Because of what? Right.
Ironic.
It is ironic, isn't it? The way Shelley dies, it's almost like he's predicting. But take a look at his prediction. Read it with me. This is some of the cooler lines of poetry you get to read. It's really kind of interesting when it lodges in your brain. He wrote these lines of poetry right before he went out on a boat and dies. Make me thy lyre. We don't say lyre today, we say guitar. Even as the forest is. Now, see, I love this about my pals who live back east. They say, what are you doing living out there, man, teaching those kids? I'm like, I can teach stuff to them that you can't teach to your kids back in Connecticut, for example, or wherever. Well, give me an example. I'll say part 5 of Ode to the West Wind. If you've ever been hunting in the fall, and see, and I say this to people who haven't been, like from back east, and they laugh at me. But some of you will go, oh, yeah, this happens all the time. You're sitting there. And from far, 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 far away, you can hear the wind coming through the trees. And it starts to blow through the trees, and all of a sudden, here it comes. It's almost like the sound of a train or something coming through the trees. Blow, blow through you, past you, all the way on the other side. Now, see, I've said already, I'm saying this as some of you guys are going, yeah, of course, that's... I am not kidding when I say there are people who have looked at me and said, dude, you are totally making that up. This, by the way, is exactly what Shelley is saying. He says, I want the wind to be like the way a guitar, the way it makes the forest sing. Keep reading. What if my leaves are falling like its own? The tumult of thy mighty harmonies will take from both a deep autumnal tone, sweet though in sadness. Be thou, spirit fierce, my spirit. Be thou me, impetuous one. Drive my dead thoughts over the universe like withered leaves to quicken a new birth. And by the incantation of this verse, scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. He works with a cool word picture. It's like he builds a fire. And it's almost going out, and all of a sudden a wind comes by and goes, and picks up some of the ashes and embers, pushes them across the universe, drops them down, and a new fire gets started. But he's not talking about starting a literal fire. He's talking about you reading his words someday. Many years from now. And it worked. He requested of the wind that his words would be blown across the universe to create a new fire, a new song. Keep reading as we finish. Be through my lips to awakened earth the trumpet of a prophecy. O wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? In other words, in the middle of the darkest winter, you can always hope for what? You know spring is coming. And that will be the final request that he makes to the wind. Take this poem to a bunch of students sitting in room 303 in 2012 and help them remember, if winter comes, can spring be far behind? A bit of hope at the end of the poem. Thank you. We'll come back to work with Skylark tomorrow.